I kept going. At least, nothing in front of me suggested that I had stopped. There was no pause, no collapse, no clear moment where I decided I couldn't continue. The places were familiar. The rhythm of the day followed its usual pattern. The small actions repeated themselves without resistance. From the outside, everything appeared intact. I woke up when I normally do. I went where I needed to go. I spoke when someone spoke to me. Nothing slowed me down. Nothing interrupted the flow. And yet, something stayed behind. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly enough to be noticed. I became aware of it in the way moments carried me forward. The second after I finished something. The pause before I started the next thing. The silence between one part of the day and another. Those spaces felt slightly different than before. Not uncomfortable, just present. I was still there, still moving, but I wasn't fully arriving the way I used to. Sounds reached me and moved on. Words arrived clearly but didn't stay. Faces looked familiar yet felt slightly distant, as if I were walking past them from a small distance inside myself. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt urgent. It was more like a subtle separation, as if I had been walking the same path for a long time, and then, without stopping, a part of me had slowed down without telling the rest of me. Everything in front of me remained the same, but the way I moved through it had changed. I paid attention to how normal everything still looked. I smiled when it made sense. I nodded at the right moments. I said the kinds of things people expect you to say. If someone had asked how I was doing, I would have answered without hesitation, and the answer would have sounded honest. That was the strange part, because inside I could feel something missing, but I couldn't translate it into words. It wasn't pain. It didn't form a sentence. It was a feeling without a storyline. A quiet awareness that something in me was no longer moving at the same speed as the rest of my life. I tried to treat it like nothing. I kept moving, kept finishing tasks, kept following the day from one moment to the next, but the feeling remained. I noticed it in repetition. The same coffee, the same streets, the same lights at the same corners. Everything familiar, yet slightly less connected to me. Not empty, not meaningless, just less immediate, as if the day was happening in front of me, and I was participating from half a step ahead of myself. I didn't resist it. I didn't try to force myself to feel more present. I only noticed that I was noticing, and that awareness changed something. Because once you realize something in you is not keeping up, even by a small amount, the day can no longer pretend to be completely whole. Everything continued as usual. Time moved forward. People spoke. The world held its shape. And I moved within it, aware that I was still going, while something in me stayed behind. I noticed it in my own voice. Not in what I said, but in how little of me was attached to it. I could hold a conversation and realize afterward that I had been speaking from habit, like the words were doing their job while something deeper stayed back. I noticed it when I looked at my own day. The schedule made sense. The tasks were ordinary. The messages were familiar, but I felt slightly separated from the meaning of it all. Not numb, just observing, as if I had stepped a few inches forward in my actions and left something quieter behind me. Even simple choices felt different. What to eat, where to sit, when to leave. They didn't feel difficult. They just felt less automatic. I had to be there to choose them instead of letting the day choose for me. And that awareness was new. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revelation. It was quiet, and because it was quiet, it was easy to doubt. But it kept returning, in the same calm way, at the same moments, as if it was waiting for me to admit that something had fallen behind. I started to notice how often I look for proof that I am fully here. A clear reaction, a clear engagement, a clear sense of being completely inside the moment. When it wasn't there, I didn't panic. I just noticed the gap, and that gap changed the texture of everything. Not the facts, not the events, just the way they arrived inside me and the way they left. I didn't mention it to anyone. There was nothing to report, but I carried the separation with me, quietly, through the same rooms and the same hours, aware that something had shifted without leaving a visible trace. I didn't react to it. There was nothing to fix, no obvious problem to solve, no clear explanation to search for. The shift didn't feel urgent. It didn't ask for action. It simply existed alongside everything else. I let the day continue without adjusting myself to it. I didn't force energy into my voice. I didn't try to convince myself that nothing was different. I didn't try to make the feeling disappear. I let it sit there, quietly, like a detail I was allowed to notice. The strange thing was how normal everything still looked. People still spoke the same way. Places still felt familiar. My routine still held together. And yet, the inside of it felt slightly altered, as if a small part of me had stayed behind and changed the angle of everything I experienced. The feeling didn't grow stronger. It didn't fade either. It stayed subtle, almost easy to overlook if I chose not to pay attention. And maybe that was the point. Not every separation announces itself. Some shifts arrive quietly, without asking to be acknowledged. They don't interrupt your life. They don't demand a response. They simply settle in and change the way things feel from the inside. Nothing around me needed to change. Nothing needed to be fixed or explained to anyone else. I didn't need to name what I felt to allow it to be there. I simply continued, knowing that something had changed, without needing to know exactly what it meant. I noticed how quickly my mind wanted to turn it into a story, to decide why it happened, to connect it to something, to make it reasonable. But the shift didn't cooperate with that. It stayed simple. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an answer. It was just a distance, small enough to live with, real enough to respect. And once I stopped trying to explain it, it became easier to carry. Not because I understood it, but because I stopped demanding that I should. I kept moving through the same hours, doing the same things, with a quiet awareness in the background, as if I was learning, for the first time, that you can keep going, and still, something in you can stay behind. Everything still looked the same, but I kept going, and something stayed behind.